the flag is the blood that was spilled in the way that your forefathers tell. And never a country been so great, the stories Britannia could tell. I never want to live my life away from the golden shores. There's never a country in the world with the scent of an English rose. England, oh England, the country so great, the land that's so fair and so true. There'll never be any colours like the red, the white and the blue. Whenever you go to the far off shores, there's something that goes with you. The pride and the joy and the love that comes from your mother of red, white and blue. St. George's spirit has never died, it all keeps coming back. England, oh England, the country's so great, the land that's so fair and so true. There'll never be any colours like the red, the white and the blue. England, oh England, the country's so great, the land that's so fair and so true. There'll never be any colours like the red, the white and the blue. England, oh England, the country's so great, the land that's so fair and so true. There'll never be any colours like the red, the white and the blue.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Just let me give you a bit of my spin at the beginning. You know, people look down at England and Britain, and we're full of immigrants, you know, with no culture and stuff like that. You know, 1,000 years, guys, 1,000 years we go back as who we are today. And that's shown in a lot of the coat of arms and things. In the flag, you can see is Elizabeth I, and one of the first like coat of arms had the lion on, and now we've progressed to 3 lions for 1,000 years, guys. You could just easily Google this up, 1,000 years, and throughout that we've had kings and queens, relations. I've got Mary Queen of Scots in. She was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, and when she got kicked out of Scotland, she come to Elizabeth, who was a cousin removed or something, for protection, you know, related by family, by birth, by heritage. But, you know, there's such a big history behind all our coats of arms, our standards that we have across the country, going right into our military and stuff like that. You know, these are a big part of our British and English history and culture, and they can't be took away. So don't listen to people when they say stuff like that. Don't listen to people. They're either very ignorant or they're very biased. Like I said, we go back 1,000 years as a distinct ethnicity, culture, and race in the British Isles, intimately linked in particular areas because of conquest and things like that. But anyway, this is a nationalising party. This is a Kings and Queens stream, guys, a Kings and Queens stream. I'm going to leave it to the mighty Paul Rimmer in a minute, but don't forget, please look at our description, join all our social media, and let me get emails up. There's our emails there, mine and Pat's emails. Please join us, get involved with us. If you want to run as a local election candidate, and Keir Starmer might be blocking the local elections this year. I wonder why, Paul. I wonder why. But anyway, Paul, over to you.
Well, that song you've just heard there, the Angelic Upstarts, has a great line in it. The stories Britannia can tell. And you went back 1,000 years there, John. We go back much further than that. I mean, we start with the Ice Age, really, and the ice slowly melting as the temperatures rose, and people that came over from Europe, they were called Allans, and these were the indigenous people of these islands, and they settled these islands. And don't forget when the Britannic Islands, our archipelago, became separate from Europe, we were still covered in forest, and the animals that roamed around these islands, there were bears, there were wolves, there were elks, there were even woolly rhinos and woolly mammoths, so you can imagine turning up to Britain 10,000 years ago, as these Allans did. They came as hunters and gatherers, but they settled in these islands, and they are the Aboriginal people. And 80% of our DNA right across these islands goes back to these indigenous Aboriginal people. This is essentially who we are. The Celts, the Saxons, the Normans, even the Romans, they're just a thin layer on top of this. But we go back deep in history. And the British Isles were one. This is very important. When the Greeks came here, about 400 BC, 400 years before Christ, they came to map these islands and to trade here. And they call these islands the Britannic Islands. All of them. Great Britain was called Magna Britannica, the big island, big Britain. And Ireland was called Maeva Britannica, Little Britain. That's the original name for Ireland. We're one people, one history. We go back thousands of years. Religious and political conflicts over the last 500 years are nothing compared to the depths of unity that bring the people of these islands together. People are deceived and think that they're separate, but they're not. We are of one blood and one spirit, ultimately. I always say an Englishman, a Welshman, a Scotsman, an Irishman, they love to share a pint. They love to share a cuppa. They love to socialise together. I see this in Liverpool every weekend. We're one people. And if we can get rid of these superficial differences, we'll be one people again, because we need to be one people. Because we're in great danger, as we know, of being dispossessed and replaced in all our islands, right across the archipelago. But around 800 BC, this is after the building of Stonehenge, so there were Iron Age forts. There's a fantastic one near Shrewsbury, and there was stone circles right across these islands before the Celts arrived. The Celts arrived from Gaul, France. That's why they're Gaelic. And they start to impose themselves on these islands and on its culture. And we start to speak their language and follow their customs. But when the Greeks were mapping these islands in 400 BC, they noticed there was a tension still between the Aboriginal people of these islands and the Celts. They hadn't quite subjugated the Aboriginal people, who sometimes spasmodically rose in rebellion. So we're going back here. We're going back 4,000 years, 3,000 years, 2,000 years. And then, after the birth of Christ, around 43 AD, the Romans come. the Roman Empire, the mighty Roman Empire, moves into Britain, founds London, 50 AD, and it pushes north, builds the Fosse Way, builds roads across these islands, conquers the north of England, and then about 112 AD, they build Hadrian's Wall to secure the northern frontier, although the Romans actually go beyond that wall. They go up to the Firth of Forth eventually. And of course, the Romans famously did not colonize Ireland. The word island, Hibernia, it relates to the word hibernation. They called Ireland the winter island, the land of rain, the land of wind, the land of cold, and they didn't want to go and live there. There was not much for the Romans. The Romans loved to grow grapes. That was the northern border of the Roman Empire where the grapes could grow. So actually north of the River Thames, they weren't that happy, but York became a great Roman town eventually, Eboracum. And one of probably the greatest coronation in these islands ever was around the start of the 4th century, 305, I think, AD. Constantine the Great was crowned Emperor of Rome in the city of York. That's how famous York is. And York is really the history of England in so many ways. But Constantine was a Christian. We just had the first Christian martyr in England, St. Alban, about just after the 4th century, 300 AD. And he accepted Christianity as the faith of the Roman Empire. In hoc signis vinces, in this sign we conquer, the sign of the cross. And that had a huge impact on Britain, because you'll find that I'm going to talk about the monarchs, but the monarch and the church are very closely linked in the history of Britain. But we move on from the Romans. The Romans leave around the 5th century, and into this vacuum comes the Saxons. But the Romano Celts, they were known, did not give up, and they had a famous King Arthur, and the Knights of the Round Table. I'm sure you've heard of them, John. King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and he tried to fight off the Saxons, but the Saxons and the Angles and the Jutes, who were Danes, this is important, they were Danes, they eventually conquered the whole of England. Not the Celtic fringe, not Wales, not Cornwall, not Devon, not Scotland, not Ireland, but they had the 7 kingdoms in England, the Mercia, Northumberland, Wessex, Essex, Sussex, and so on. And initially, Northumberland was the strongest, and Northumberland went right up to Edinburgh. Edinburgh means the castle of Edwin. It was a Saxon town, Edinburgh. It wasn't Scottish. It was founded as a Saxon town. So the Saxons, Northumberland was the main kingdom, and then it passed to Mercia, which was the middle of England. And of course, the great king of Mercia was King Offa, who built Offa's Dyke, who created that boundary with Wales, which is still there today. You can still walk along the length of Offa's Dyke today, even though it was built in the 8th century. But what happens at the end of the 8th century, about 795, the Vikings appear, the Norsemen from Norway and Sweden, from northern Scandinavia, and they're pagans, and they're the warriors and the raiders. Now, people think the Vikings came here for gold. They attacked the monasteries and stole the gold plate and the silver cups and so on. But what they were really after were the vats of wine in the monasteries. The Vikings loved to party. They loved to get pissed, and they wanted the wine. Huge vats of wine were held in these monasteries for communion services, and just for people drank wine, Wine was like a precious commodity in those days. Everything seemed to revolve around it. But anyway, the Vikings came, the Danes, and they defeated the Saxons. Eventually they overwhelmed the kingdom of Northumberland. Northumbria. They overwhelmed the kingdom of Mercia. They overwhelmed the eastern kingdoms of the Saxons, and there was only one Saxon kingdom left, and that was Wessex. And that's where our monarchy roots itself, in the kingdom of Wessex, in the king of Wessex, Egbert. Egbert and his 5 sons, the youngest of whom was Alfred, who eventually succeeded to the throne after all his brothers had sort of died fighting the Vikings. and he wins a famous victory, Alfred, 871 at the Battle of Ashdown. He defeats the Danes, Guthrum, and forces the Danes to actually get baptized and become Christians. And Alfred emerges as the savior of the Anglo-Saxons, as they're called, the Anglo-Saxons. And he sort of rescues Wessex from the Vikings. The Vikings has virtually overwhelmed the whole of England. But after the Battle of Ashdown, he imposes himself, sets up a capital at Winchester, and becomes known as Alfred the Great, the only English monarch to be known as the Great, Alfred the Great. But in fact, he's not the King of England. He's only the King of Wessex. He's only the King of southern England. And England divides. The north is controlled by the Danes, Danelaw. And the south is always in jeopardy of being overwhelmed by the Danes. And it was his great-grandson, Athelstan, who in 997, with the blessing of the church, raises a Saxon army and marches north to take on the Danes, who've now allied with the Celts and the Norsemen, and he takes them on at the Battle of Brumbra. Battles are very important in the history of monarchy. If you're going to succeed, you've got to win battles. And the Anglo-Saxon, the English army, takes on the might of the Vikings and the Danes and the Celts, the Welsh, the Irish, the Scots. He takes them on at the Battle of Brunanburh, which is people believe was fought in the Wirral at a place called Bromborough. And he prevailed, Athelstan. He defeated his foes. And they have to, in defeat, they took homage to him. They bowed the knee and they said to Athelstan, Rex Britannicus, you are the king of the Britons, of all Britons, across the whole British Isles, Britannic Isles as it's called. You are the king, and we acknowledge you as the overlord. And that really has remained with the King of England ever since. But the Danes, you know, they weren't going to give up so easily. And although they paid homage, they were plotting revenge. But in the end of the 10th century, about 960, Edgar is crowned King of England. He succeeds Athelstan. Edgar's very important because the man who crowns him, St. Dunstan, the Bishop of Glastonbury, he arranges a coronation for Edgar. Previously, the king had just been proclaimed and he'd been crowned, he'd had a party. Edgar writes down a coronation and he declares that Edgar, glorious king of the Anglo-Saxons, by the grace of God, the captain of Christ, he makes the King of England an anointed Lord of God, someone to be esteemed and revered, and someone who receives the eternal blessings of God, someone who deserves the submission of his own people. As Christ is the King of Kings, so Edgar, as a king, now represents Christ in Britain. And it's a very powerful coronation, and it's the first one like that in England. And it puts the English crown in a very esteemed position, and it unites the whole of the realm. The church now is like the foot soldiers of the monarch. They're working hand in glove now to create this new nation of England. It's still an Anglo-Saxon nation. But the man who succeeded Edgar, Ethelred the Unready, is known as. Actually, it's Ethelred the Reedless. Means Ethelred really the fool. And he squanders his inheritance. And the Danes, sniffing that the English should become prosperous, the English should become wealthy and well organized, they see rich pickings in England. And a Danish army arrives on the shores of England. And in Essex, at the Battle of Maldon, they defeat the Anglo-Saxons and push the Anglo-Saxons off the throne. A guy called Sven Forkbeard. Sven Forkbeard bequeaths the throne of England to his son, Canute. Canute the man. You'll know Canute, John. King Canute. They thought he was all powerful, and he said, I can't stop the waves. Put me on a beach. You'll see, I am not all powerful. God is more powerful than me. The Danes had now become Christians, so the church, he works also hands in glove with the church, and the Danes take over England. England could have become a Danish country, a Danish-speaking country, until Edward the Confessor. The Danish line quickly runs out. They don't have any children. And Edward the Confessor returns from Normandy, where he's been in exile. He's an Anglo-Saxon and becomes the king, but he has no children. He's a man of God. He regards himself as a priest, effectively. And so when Edward the Confessor dies in 1066, the Witan, which is like the ruling council of the Anglo-Saxons, they appoint Harold Godwinson as his successor, as king. But a guy over in Normandy, known as William the Bastard, he was known as. We call him William the Conqueror. He said, hang on. They've said that I'm going to be the next king of England. Edward the Confessor has made an oath, said that I will be succeeded. I'm coming over to claim the crown. Now, there was also, the Danes were back in the action. They wanted to claim the crown. And they invade England. And they fight the Saxons, the famous battle in 1066, the battle at Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire. And they beat the Danes. The Saxons beat the Danes, Harold Godwinson. And then he receives news that the Norman French have landed. Where, John? Hastings. Hastings, 1066, the famous battle. So he marches his army from Yorkshire down to Sussex. It's a forced march. Pretty knackered when they get there. But the Normans are not just an ordinary group of people. The Normans are the Praetorian Guard of the Catholic Church. They have lands in southern Italy and in the Mediterranean, and they're fighting for the Reconquista in Spain. They're fighting the armies of the Muslims right across the Mediterranean. They're a warrior people, the Normans. And when they arrive at Hastings, they bring with them a lot of the French nobility, Flemish nobility, and they're determined to take control of England and to claim this land, which would be a great prize for them. And we know that Harold dies at Hastings, shot through the eye with an arrow. And the Saxon army, is decimated by the Normans. William the Conqueror marches into London and is crowned king of all England. Now, the thing with William the Conqueror, he's brought this huge army of Norman knights and French knights over with him, and he displaces the Saxon thanes. This is the Saxon ruling class, the Saxon lords, who control every village and every hundreds. The Saxons divide England into hundreds. These thanes control Saxon England, and they're totally dispossessed. 11,000 of them are kicked off their land and replaced by Norman French and Flemish continentals. And this is a complete change in the ruling class of England. And the church is behind this, because the Normans, as I say, are the Praetorian Guard of the church. And they become a new strata. It's almost like a caste system, because the ordinary Saxons can't relate to the Normans. They speak a different language. They have a different culture. They're much more advanced than the Saxons. They build these glorious churches like Durham Cathedral, and they build castles and fortresses the length and breadth of England and Wales. You know, they build the Tower of London is the first one, and they basically say, we're here, it's permanent, we're not going away, we're taking control. Of course, we have the famous Doomsday Book. William chronicles every piece of property in this country. It says, everything belongs to me now. I'm your king. You only have it on my charity. And if I want it, I'll take it. You have to pay tax on everything. Tax to the church, tax to the Norman monarch. It was called the Norman yoke. The people weren't happy with this. And indeed, a lot of Saxons rose in rebellion. There was Hereward the Wake, the Isle of Ely. But in York, Jorvik, which was much more Danish than the rest of England, they created their own kingdom. And William the Conqueror went north with his troops, and he went and he harried the north. It's called the harrying of the north. In fact, he put them to the sword. 1 in 3 of the people in the north of England was killed by William the Conqueror. They had to bow the knee. They had to realize now that if you want to survive, you have to bow the knee to the Norman yoke. And the church sanctified that because he was now God's chosen king. And wow, was that a change in our island. But the Normans made us an international powerhouse because they quickly became involved in the Crusades. And the Crusades were about the militarization of Christendom to fight Islam. And England got itself a new purpose now. And we see that most gloriously in the reign of Richard the Lionheart, Ricard Coeur de Lion. Of course, he was French speaking, the Normans were French. But this is what really created England in many ways, because the Third Crusade was the English Crusade. And he raised money across the country. Everyone had to contribute. And he raised a massive army. And he went to fight in the Holy Land under the cross of St. George, which was to become, after that, our national flag. We already had the 3 lines. Now we had the cross of St. George. And Richard Coeur de Lion, he went out and he fought Saladin, the great Saracen warrior, Arab warrior, Muslim warrior, and he defeated him. The Battle of Acro and the Battle of Jaffa. He was a great warrior, Richard the Lionheart. But he didn't have the troops. He felt he didn't have the resources to take Jerusalem. So he came home. On his way home, he was captured and he was held as hostage. And everyone had to pay a huge fortune in England to free him. Of course, there was a group of people who didn't like the crusade, who didn't feel part of it. And they were the Jewish community in England. And people had been selling their land in order to help finance the crusade. And the Jews had been profiting on this. And they were also being accused of hoarding silver and clipping the coins. The coins were silver, and the English Jews would clip them to a little bit of, just a tiny bit of silver off, but a tiny bit of silver, you mount it all up, soon they had a lot of silver. And there was a lot of populist resentment against the Jews, and it spilled over in a place called York again, Clifford Tower in York, and they were attacked. The Jews were attacked, and they hid in that tower, Clifford Tower. But a Christian preacher, they were always being called to faith, the Jews, and rejecting it. And they were going to storm the tower, and the Jews realized that what they wanted was their possessions, so they set their possessions on fire. The Jews did themselves, and the whole tower went up in a blaze. And I think something like 200 Jews died in that famous, or the infamous massacre of the Clifford Tower in York. And of course, the Jews were soon to be expelled from England. In 1290, Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, told the Jews they had to convert or leave, and they were effectively kicked out of England. Because after Richard the Lionheart, we go into Henry III and his son, Edward I. Now, Henry III, he'd formed a parliament. Simon de Montfort. He needed the French. He was very allied with the French nobility, and they were still active in England, and they wanted a parliament. They wanted some control of the king. And Simon de Montfort, he formed the model parliament, where all the barons and the knights got together, and they basically said to the king, we don't want you to tax us, live off your own money, which the king wasn't too happy with. And it led to a little war in Britain, the famous Battle of Lewes on the Sussex coast. And Edward, the Prince Edward, the son of the king, was taken hostage. But eventually he managed to escape, and he raised an army, and he fought again with the barons in 1265 at the Battle of Evesham, and he captured Simon de Montfort. And not only did he kill him, he quartered him, he cut him into 4 pieces and slung his body over the battlefield. And this was the emergence of Edward I, Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots, who was a fearsome warrior, 6'7" tall. And he went to the Holy Land on the last crusade, the 9th Crusade. If you were to be a glorious king of England in the medieval period, you had to go on a crusade. You had to go and win a victory against the Muslims. And he had done that. Like his predecessor, Richard the Lionheart, he won the Battle of Acro against the Arabs. But he came back to England after being in the Holy Land, and he saw how the Crusader towns were shaped in the Holy Land. There'd be a castle, and then there'd be a wall, a fortified wall around the town to protect him from the Saracens. So when he comes back to England and he becomes the king of England, he decides that the Welsh now have to pay homage to him. And Llewellyn, Prince Llewellyn, refused to bow the knee. So he moved into Wales. He built Flint Castle, then he built Conway Castle. And you can see he got a mason, St. James, Mason St. George, St. James of the Holy Land of Jerusalem. He got him to build these Welsh towns like Carnarvon and Conway. Have you ever been to these Welsh towns, John? These castles in North Wales? Sorry, John, you're muted. You're muted.
Yeah, not really. Not had any big
Conway?
time.
You've never
or
been
anything.
to Conway?
I've been to Conway, but I wouldn't have spent much time there.
Do you remember? Do you know these Welsh castles in North Wales? Conway Castle, Carnarvon Castle. Well, Carnarvon Castle was based on the walls of Constantinople, which he saw Edward I. But he was recreating in North Wales these Crusader towns. This is what he was doing. But he subdued the Welsh, and he made his son famously, Prince Edward, Prince of Wales. And he said, you've got to accept him to the Welsh people. Yes, he's not Welsh, but he doesn't speak English because he can't even speak. So you've got to accept him. And he became the Prince of Wales. And ever since, the heir to the throne, the eldest son of the king, becomes the Prince of Wales. I mean, Prince William now is the Prince of Wales, as Prince Charles was before he became King Charles. So Edward extends England into North Wales, the famous old Welsh principality, because they're not kings in Wales, they're just princes. That's Gwynedd, is Clwyd. They're taken over by the English. And but he actually takes the Welsh soldiers, the Welsh longbowmen, who he has a lot of respect for, and he takes them north to Scotland because he wants to subdue the Scots into a place of submission. Now, the Scots initially rebelled, the Battle of Falkirk Bridge, I think, William Wallace, and they defeat the First English army, but eventually they're beaten and they have to surrender. William Wallace, he's killed, a bit like Simon de Montfort, quartered. His head is stuck on the gate of York. And the Scots are subdued. And Edward, King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, becomes king of the whole of Great Britain and Ireland. He's the first king, really effectively, of the whole British Isles. And so he's a very significant figure. Of course, in 1290, as I said earlier, he expelled the Jews, again over the Crusades, and again over the fact that they were accused of usury, making, not working for a living, but making interest out of money instead of, which was regarded as unchristian. And they were expelled completely from the country. They were told either to attend Christian services or go out the country, and they left. So after 1290, for 400 years, there was no Jews in England. The Jews are being expelled. But the thing is with Edward I, he had 17 children to Eleanor of Aquitaine. That's the most children of any king, legitimate children. 17 healthy children he had in marriage to one woman, Eleanor of Aquitaine. He was a great warrior, and he made England very powerful. But his son, his eldest son, Edward II, was a big disappointment. And he was unlike his father. He wasn't a warrior. He was a playboy. There was rumors about his sexuality, and he was, he didn't rule the kingdom well. He seemed to be irresponsible. This seems to be a trait. If you have a very strong, overbearing father, you'd end up with these weak eldest sons, And at the Battle of Bannockburn, famously in Scotland, I think about 1312, I think it was, Robert the Bruce, who actually was in background a Norman knight, actually, although he was fighting for Scotland, he defeats Edward II and expels him from Scotland, expels the English from Scotland. Very famous victory. Now, Edward II, if you don't win battles in medieval England, if you don't win battles, you're rejected by the barons, and he is actually killed, Kenilworth Castle, and the throne passes to his son, Edward III. Edward III is a very significant king, 1327, because the Crusades have come to an end. And who are the kings going to fight now? Who are they going to prove their virility against now? They've subdued the Scots, they've subdued the Welsh. It's time to take on the French. And Edward III claims the throne of France. He says the throne of France belongs to the King of England through the Duke of Normandy. And he has his famous son, the Black Prince, wins the Battle of Crécy and defeats the French and starts the 100 Years' War. For 100 Years' War now, we're fighting against France. This is the English nobility. Now, you can imagine the English serfs and peasants. They're not part of the ruling order. I mean, they're protected by the church, and the kings are very benevolent to the people. This is their Christian duty. But they're not involved in any of the decision making, and they're called to go to war. So Edward III very wisely decides to whip up patriotism in England. And he makes the English language the language of Parliament, the language of the courts. He Anglifies the government in England. He Anglifies the ruling class. We are now English. And there's an emergence of a poet called Geoffrey Chaucer, who writes the Canterbury Tales, becomes the poet of England. And so you get the English that they're speaking now in medieval England, this is in the 14th century, is not the Anglo-Saxon that was there before the Norman invasion in 1066. This is Anglo-Saxon, there's 10,000 French words in the English language. The word order has changed. We now have a French word order, and the pronunciation has changed. It's a lot softer. So if ich spreche Deutsch, you can tell straight away it's a foreign language. Parlez-vous français? It's a lot higher language. English is a mix of both. But this is where England emerges. 1350s, the English language emerges. And of course, today, the English language rules the world. So it was a very, precipitous birth, the birth of the English language during the reign of Edward III. So after these victories in France, the problem is, with the death of the Black Prince, Edward III's son, the throne goes to his grandson, Richard II, who's only a child. I think he's about 12 at the time. Call this a minority. And he comes under the influence of French barons, and he reintroduces the French language, which is unpopular. But he fails to pay the troops that have fought in France. And furthermore, he imposes a poll tax on the people of England, the peasants of England. Now, during this period, there's an emergence of a guy called John Wycliffe, who translates the Bible into English, into the new language. And there's a famous preacher who goes around called John Ball, who preaches this line, John, I don't know if you've ever heard it. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? It was a radical egalitarianism. What was emerged? The English were emerging on the scene now, the peasantry, and they were saying, look, We're not going to submit to the Normans anymore. We're not going to submit to the Norman yoke. This is what Edward III's patriotism had ignited. We are English now, and we're going to rule in our own country. And they rise as one, the English, and it's called the Peasant Rebellion. You ever heard of that, John? The Peasant Rebellion, Wat Tyler, 1380s. And the peasants of Essex, of Kent, each peasantry formed itself, the county men they were called. They come from a county. So they come, the peasants of Sussex, the men of Sussex. And they marched on London, and they took control of London. And they got the Archbishop of Canterbury, and they chopped his head off. And they got anyone they disliked, and they just chopped their heads off. And they pulled down the palaces, and they said, we are the English people, and we're reclaiming our nation. Now, the ruling class didn't know what to do because, they were used to the peasants being subservient, that the church, but the church had lost its authority. The ruling class, the aristocracy, the nobility had lost its authority, and the peasants were in control of London. And so the only thing they could think of doing was to get the king to negotiate with Wat Tyler. So they arranged a meeting. The problem is, Wat Tyler turned up drunk and started to mock the king himself. This was an overthrow of the social order. And the nobility with the king didn't like this, and they put a dagger right through Wat Tyler and killed him. And Richard II rode out to meet, he was now 14, he rode out to meet the peasants and said, I will be your captain, and you will have no captain but me. And the barons reimposed their authority brutally. Leaders of the peasant rebellion were hung, and they were put right back in their place. But Richard II wasn't popular at all. And the son of John of Gaunt, who was a brother of Edward III, Henry Beauclerc. Was it Henry Beauclerc? Or Henry Bolingbroke. Henry Bolingbroke, yeah. He rose up in rebellion against Richard II and overthrew him. The famous Battle of Shrewsbury. And he took over the crown of England, Henry IV, with the support of the church. He establishes himself, because he's the grandson of Edward III, as the king. Richard II is killed at Pontefract Castle. He's starved to death. His son, Henry V, succeeds him. But there's still a lot of tension in the kingdom. And Henry V, there's a very famous play by Shakespeare called about Henry V. Cry for England, Harry and St. George. He rallies the English again and says, we're going back to France to claim the crown that belongs to us. This is the 100 Years' War. And he takes the English into France and he wins the famous battle, the Battle of Agincourt. You ever heard of that battle, John? The Battle of Agincourt, 1415. The English, the Welsh longbowmen, they slaughter the French cavalry. And the English eventually capture Paris. And the son of Henry V, Henry VI, becomes the King of France and the King of England. He's crowned in Paris, the King of France. But Henry VI, a bit like Edward II, is a bit of a dunce and is a bit bizarre. And he's not effective as a king. And he loses France. And eventually Warwick, the kingmaker, overthrows him. And Edward IV defeats him in the Wars of the Roses, John. Have you heard that? The Wars of the Roses. Lancaster against York. The Wars of the Roses. Henry VI is overthrown by Edward IV, and eventually killed in the Battle of Tewkesbury. Edward IV becomes the king. But his brother, who was supposed to, when he dies, Edward IV, his brother is supposed to be the guardian of the princes. I don't know if you've heard of this, John. The Princes in the Tower. Richard III, the hunchback, he kills the princes in the tower and claims the throne for himself. And of course, this again, it creates a stink. The dynastic battles in medieval England are very vicious indeed, as they were across Europe. But there's a struggle for power, wealth. Being a king was everything. But it left a bad odor, killing the princes. And Henry Tudor Henry VII, the Welshman. He raises an army and he challenges Richard III to battle, the Battle of Bosworth Field. And in that battle, he prevails and Richard is killed. My horse, my kingdom for a horse, the famous Shakespeare play. Our national playwright, Shakespeare, he captured a lot of this medieval history, you know. All the time, England has been developing now, and it's a unitary state. It's becoming one of the strongest states in Europe, and it's got its own identity, and emerges Henry VII, Tudor monarchy. Tudors take power. Now, think about Henry VII. He wasn't French, he was Welsh. And he said, I am the first true Briton to be on the English throne since King Arthur. And he starts, again, they worked with the church. He builds King's College Chapel in Cambridge, starts that off. And he strengthens the monarchy. And when he dies, his son takes over. Bluff King Hal, he's known as Henry VIII. And man alive, was that a dramatic time, regal time, because Henry VIII, initially, he's the defender of the faith. He stands up against Luther. He stands up against the reformers. But unable to have a legitimate son and unable to get a divorce, he asks the reformers to break with Rome. 1533. You've got to understand this is probably the most significant thing in English history. He breaks with Rome and casts out the authority of the Pope from England and makes himself the supreme head of the church. He dissolves the monasteries. But he's only able to do this because of Luther and the Protestant Reformation in Europe, which comes to Britain. And it's deepened by his son, Edward VI. But then it's all quickly reversed by his daughter, Bloody Mary, Mary Tudor, who executes 300 Protestants, burns them at the stake. And, this is at a time of real turmoil and tumult in England, And it's gruesome, really. And it only really comes to an end, it doesn't come to an end, really. In 1558, Queen Elizabeth I, good Queen Bess, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, she becomes the Queen of England, reestablishes the Protestant faith. And we see a real flowering of England in this period. This is when England really becomes a superpower, a magnificent country, because not only do we have Shakespeare, but we have our great seafarers like Francis Drake, the Age of Discovery. We have our first colony in North America, Virginia, the Virgin Queen. And we defeat the mighty superpower of the day, the Spanish. They send an armada to capture England, and it's defeated. The Battle of the Armada, it's sunk, and the English emerge victorious. And now we have this incredible battle with Ireland. Hugh O'Neill in Ireland supports the Catholic cause, and he gets the backing of Spain, and he rebels against the Queen. And the Queen sends over, eventually, the Earl of Mountjoy. And a 9-year war in Ireland, he subjugates Hugh O'Neill with the support of a lot of Irish nobility. And this is the start of the Irish Troubles in many ways. But the Irish are defeated. Shakespeare wrote the play Henry V to rouse the English to go and fight the Irish in the 9 Years' War. But Queen Elizabeth I emerges as a glorious queen, good Queen Bess. She said, I rule with the love of my subjects. That's what matters most to me. But she doesn't leave any heirs. She never gets married. She has no children. So the throne passes, and this is again very significant, to James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, who Elizabeth I had to execute because she was involved in Catholic plots to kill her. Now, James VI of Scotland, as a Protestant, becomes James I of England, and he translates the Bible, the famous translation of the Bible, the King James Version of the Bible, which consolidates the English language and becomes really the rock on which the English nation, the British nation, is to be built. And he did something else, James I. He brought Scottish and English settlers to Ulster, the plantation of Ulster. Ulster was a renegade province. There was constant rebellions there. There was nothing in Ulster really. There was only 2 stone buildings in the whole of Ulster: Carrickfergus Castle and Bangor Abbey. So he says it's empty. We're going to colonise it. He invites the Scots and Irish to move in, the Scots and English to move in. Londonderry is built. The walls of Londonderry. They build the ports, Bangor and Belfast, and they develop Ulster. Ulster becomes a crown colony. And the people of Ulster are called the British. Before the foundation of Ulster, we were English, Scottish, Irish, and Welsh, but we were Britons. But this word emerges for the first time. We are the British. And this is where they emerge in Ulster. Ulster's a key to the development of the British Empire and the British sort of perspective on the world. And anyway, James dies and his son, Charles I, takes over. Charles I, John. What's going to happen to Charles I? He's going to get his head chopped off because he wants to be an absolute monarch in the French style. But the English now, they've seen what's happened in the Dutch Republic, the Dutch in Amsterdam. The Dutch have got their freedom from Spain and a new way of government, where you have to listen to the people and respect the will of the people. The people under God are sovereign. This is the message of the English Civil War. And Charles won't accept that. He says, the king, I am sovereign by God's will. And this is the conflict which leads to the English Civil War and the emergence of Oliver Cromwell as the leader of the Roundheads. And Oliver Cromwell fights in 24 major battles across England, the Battle of Marston Moor, the Battle of Naseby, where he defeats the Royalists, across Ireland and across Scotland. And he wins every single battle. Oliver Cromwell becomes victorious. And he actually ends the English monarchy because in 1649, whack, chops off the head of Charles I at Whitehall in London because Charles I is deemed a traitor. He's plotting with foreign powers to subdue the English people. Cromwell emerges as the father of the nation. I mean, that's a story in itself, Cromwell. And Cromwell, he rules from 1650 to 1660. And he dies 10 years, a decade, the Commonwealth. When he dies, his son proves ineffective. And there's this great confusion in the land. And eventually they invite the son of Charles I, Charles II, the Merry Monarch, to recreate the monarchy in England. So that's the story up to then, John. I mean, there's a lot in that story. Any response to all that, John, at this stage?
No, it's just amazing stuff, you know what I mean? And, I learned a lot of this at school and stuff like that. But, it's amazing stuff. And, it shows a development of our culture and everything, leading to Parliament coming and stuff like that. And our English language, world known, trade, innovation, culture, art, everything. We was absolutely banging it out at this time. And, you mentioned what's called the Great Shakespeare and stuff like that, and the things that they did, it's just all a big part of who we are, coming from these islands, you know what I mean, leading up to right to this day. It's amazing. Pat's been amazing in the chat. He's liked it and it's been good. It's interesting, and like you said, it was when someone got deposed or there was a battle, it often ended up with their heads chopped off, didn't it? And that's a minimum, you know what I mean? They'd be lucky to get kicked out of the country and have to go living in Argentina or something like that. But it was brutal. But it's what developed us, made us a nation to bring us who we are today.
What I've done there, John, it's really only part one. because the really good stuff is in part 2, because after Charles II, his brother takes over, James II, and tries to bring back Catholicism, and it's a reaction against that. And the Immortal Seven, the Bishop of London and his brothers, they invite William of Orange to cross the sea from Holland. He arrives in Brixham in Devon, and he becomes William III of England, begins the Glorious Revolution. And that's another story in itself. Well, I'll leave that for another time. Part 2. The 61 monarchs have ruled England since King Egbert of all, when we went back to Wessex and the Vikings right at the start. 61 monarchs. We've still got another 20 to go. This is the modern age. This is when England, having been formed and having created its identity, now becomes the dominant power of the whole world. Forget China, forget India, forget Germany, forget France, forget Spain, forget Italy, forget Russia. It's England that emerges as the great power of the world. And this is after the Glorious Revolution of 1690. And man, is that a story.
It's Christmas Eve on our next show, so we've got to just do Christmas and have decorations up and that. So that'll be Tuesday, Christmas Eve, guys. Christmas Eve. So let's make it a good one on Christmas Eve. But thank you very much. Really interesting. I could easily keep up with him. You see me highlighting stuff that he'd said within his talking, people that he brought up, battles that he brought up. I highlighted all them just to show you that, you know, the stuff. We could go on forever. We could go on forever. And I mean, throughout all that, like I said, innovation, architecture and all that, influenced by the Romans, the Saxons and Normans, built all our great cathedrals and our great big church areas, which is some of the best fantastic things in the world, you know. And, you know, that kind of stuff got translated across Europe and across the world to buildings like that and architecture like that. But amazing, Paul. Amazing. Amazing.
Great stuff, John.
Thank you very much, everyone. Nationalising Party. Don't forget, next week, Christmas Eve will be up. Please look to us. If you want to donate, email us or anything like that, you can do. And please do as well. And this is a Nationalising Party. That's a mighty Paul Rimmer. And we've just give you a really good run on thousands of years of history to do with the British Isles. God bless everyone. Thank you very much.
Good night, folks. God bless. Cheers, John.
See you, mate.